Okay, I wanted to make this video because the electricity went out on me yesterday when we were filming this the first time and the file wasn't recoverable. So here we are with our second attempt of trying making it through Chordates number 1. In this particular lecture, we went through the first Chordates PowerPoint. It took us all the way from the beginning of Chordates to Amphibians. I reminded everybody that lecture quiz number 8 is currently on D2L. And there's a post-lab quiz 9, that's going to be based off of any of the organisms that we introduced today. We won't get all the way through Chordates, so we'll have to come back next time, either on Wednesday or Thursday, and finish the second part to Chordates. That's going to include reptiles. Birds are nested inside the reptile group, so we have birds nested within the reptiles, and then we'll also include mammals. We're going to have more videos and questions about reptiles, birds, and mammals on post-lab quizzes following our Wednesday discussion. But jumping into Chordates number 1, let's get this off of the board so that we can do a roadmap of where we're going to go with these Chordates. So if we're thinking about Chordates, remember that Chordates are part of the deuterostome clade. The deuterostomes we had looked at previously, this was a clade that included the chordates and the echinoderms. We had introduced echinoderms last time as those spiny skinned organisms like the sea star and the sea urchins. The other phyla, the phylum Chordata that we belong to, we're going to introduce today. They're going to include organisms like the Tunicates, the lancelets, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The first two, the Tunicates and the lancelets, are probably the least familiar in terms of those chordate phyla, in terms of those chordate examples. So let's start maybe by making a list of all of the chordates and seeing how they're related to one another. And we'll start by zooming in on this single branch of chordates. If we could zoom into this clade of deuterostomes, it would look something like this, where on the first branch we have those echinoderms, the spiny-skinned organisms, and then the second branch would be all of the chordates. So everything here in this red bracket is part of that chordate branch. And you can see if we zoom into that chordate branch, there's quite a lot of details that we can see. So I'm going to try and start right with this single branch of the chordates, and we're going to try and draw that up on the board. If we could just exclude those echinoderms. So they're gone now, and we're just looking at this clade of chordates. There are at least 4 characteristics that all chordates are going to have in common. One of those characteristics is this notochord. In fact, if we just look at this picture, it shows us the 4 characteristics that all chordates have in common. There's this dorsal hollow nerve cord. And everything prior to this, the nerve cord has run down the ventral side of the body, like the segmented worms and the mollusks. But here in chordates, that nerve cord runs down the dorsal side of the body. Just underneath that dorsal hollow nerve cord, we can see what's called the notochord. It's a stiffened rod of cells that provides support to that nerve cord. It's not a true vertebrate, it's not encased in bone, but it does provide some support to that nerve cord. So notochord supports the nerve cord, and if we look at the complete digestive system, we can see a mouth at one end, an anus at the other. And in the throat area of these chordates, there are slits within the pharyngeal pouches. These are called pharyngeal gill slits. In the primitive chordates, these are going to be used to help filter feed. We're going to see water is pulled into the mouth, and any food items that are in the water are going to get trapped inside the digestive system, and the fresh water is pushed out through the sides of these gill slits. And again, the food items are stuck in the digestive tract and are absorbed. The waste passes out the anus. Speaking of that anus, you can see past the anus there is a tail that extends past the anus. This muscular postanal tail is also a characteristic of chordates. So all chordates are going to have at least some part of their life cycle. It could be the embryonic development stages, but at some point in their life cycle, all chordates are going to have these 4 characteristics. Dorsal hollow nerve cord, notochord underneath that dorsal hollow nerve cord, giving it support, pharyngeal gill slits, and a muscular postanal tail. So let's look through the slides to see some examples of these chordates. And I'll draw this on the board. This is something that you won't have to draw, but I'll say that it would be helpful if you're able to draw this, and you can, if you can put this on the back of one of your exam sheets, you can refer back to this diagram and navigate the exam questions that way. I'll start somewhere at the top just by listing these are either going to be classes or subphyla. Maybe an easy way of doing this is just by listing the subphyla or the class names and then kind of drawing the brackets that show their relationships. So Cephalochordata is going to be where we start at the top. The Cephalochordata, this is going to include a group of organisms that we're going to call the lancelets. So I'll give an example as a lancelet. The second group we're going to call Urochordata. And an example of this group from Urochordata are going to be the Tunicates, sometimes called sea squirts. We're going to see underneath Urochordata there is going to be the first example of chordates that have a skull. This is going to be a class called Myxini. And an example of an organism that belongs to this class Myxini are going to be the Hagfish. Let's keep going. If we go underneath Myxini, there's another class of organisms called Petromyzontity. Petromyzontity is going to describe a class of organisms that include the lampreys. So we'll see a lamprey as our example of this class, Petromyzontity. Beneath that, there is a class of cartilaginous fish called Chondriichthyes. Chondral just means cartilage, and ichthyes means fish. So chondriichthyes describes cartilaginous fish. Examples would be sharks and rays, like stingrays. Underneath chondriichthyes, we're going to see the next three classes are all describing different types of fish. There is what we call Actinopterygii. Actinopterygii describes a group of fish called ray-finned fishes. I'll say ray-finned. In fact, I'm going to put that underneath here. Actinopterygii describes these ray-finned fish. The second group of fish is called Actinistia. Actinistia is also a group of fish, but these are the lobe-finned fish. We'll say lobe-finned. And then the third group is called Dipnoe. This class, Dipnoe, includes the lungfish. I'll just get a different color to try and show that these classes are the fishes. Then there are only three other classes that we're going to put underneath the fishes. There are the amphibians, there are the reptiles, birds are going to be included into this group, and then finally the mammals. We've run out of room, but this has given us our roadmap for where we are going to go with this lecture as well as our next lecture. Just to show the evolutionary relationships between these groups, now that we have them listed, we can start here at the bottom and show that reptiles and mammals share a recent common ancestor. Then we're going to compare, or we're going to bracket together the amphibians to the reptiles and mammals. We're going to do the same thing for this Dipnoe class, the lungfish, the lobe-finned fish, the ray-finned fish, the cartilaginous fish, the lampreys, the hagfish, and then even these two groups, Chordata and Cephalochordata. I'm kind of running low on space, but that little branch, the last one that's sticking out, this is representing the branch of all chordates. So if we go down this branch, we're going to see that all chordates have those four characteristics that we just listed, like the notochord as one, and there were three other things: dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, muscular post-anal tail. All of those were characteristics of chordates. There's all of our chordates. As we go down this branch of chordates, you can see it immediately splits into two branches. We're going to label the first three branches as subphyla to this phylum Chordates. So we'll call this a subphyla. The first subphyla is Cephalochordata. It includes examples like lancelets. We're about to see a picture of one. This lancelet is going to have all of the four characteristics that chordates have, and it's going to retain those four characteristics throughout its adult stage. This second branch down here is going to lead us to another subphyla. This subphyla is called Chordata, and it's also a chordate. It's going to have those same four characteristics that all chordates have. However, the chordates are going to metamorphosize, where their adult stage of their life cycle doesn't still retain those four characteristics that all chordates have: the notochord, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and muscular post-anal tail. So as we look further into this branch of chordates, the first two branches we see are subphyla, and even this third branch that we're about to look further into, this branch is going to represent the third subphyla. Everything that is part of this third branch is going to have a skull. So the characteristic that these add to the list of all characteristics is they have a mineralized skull. So from hagfish all the way down to mammals, we're going to see an actual bony skull, meaning that anything above this, so the Chordates and Cephalochordates, don't have an actual skull. This presence of a skull is what led to the third subphyla, called the Craniates. So Craniates have a skull. Everything past this branch is going to have a skull, but we can see there are more forks in the road, so there are additional characteristics that we're going to add. Let's just list each of those. So if we look inside this clade of Craniates, anything that has a skull, we're going to see that there is another nested group called Vertebrates. They have a mineralized backbone. The presence of a vertebrae starts with these organisms that we're going to call lampreys. They have a true vertebrae. They also have a skull, but we're going to see things like hagfish. They have a skull, but they don't have a vertebrae. If we look inside this clade of vertebrates, we're going to see, again, if you're inside this clade of vertebrates, you have a backbone. But if we look inside the clade of vertebrates, there are some vertebrates that add to the list of characteristics. Some of them actually have a clasping jaw that they can bite with. So if you have a jaw, then you're part of this nested clade called gnathostomes, clasping jaw. So sharks and rays have a jaw all the way down to mammals. Everything in this clade has a jaw. Not all organisms with a jaw have a bony skeleton. So we'll see things like sharks and rays. These are cartilaginous fish. We'll say cartilaginous fish versus this branch down here, which are bony fish. Bony fish are going to add another characteristic to the list. We're going to see that bony fish are also going to have swim bladders. I don't have a lot of room to write on the board, so I'm just trying to use my space to show bony fish also have these structures called swim bladder. It's basically lung derivative. So all of these bony fish have some type of swim bladder. We're going to see that some of these bony fish add lobe fins. So lobe fins are fins that have muscles and bones in them and can move the organism around more forcefully than just having ray fins. So lobe-finned fish, like the coelacanth, belong to this Actinistia. Some of these lobe-finned fish add a characteristic. They add lungs. So some of these lobe-finned fish that actually have lungs, that is going to be, an example of that group would be Dipnoe, the lungfish. If you have lungs, that's fine. Dipnoe has lungs, but it doesn't have 4 limbs. It's a fish. So we're going to see some of these lung-bearing organisms added a characteristic of 4 limbs. These are the tetrapods. Tetrapods, this is a clade of organisms that, again, all of them have 4 limbs like the name suggests. So amphibians have 4 limbs, reptiles and mammals all have 4 limbs. We're going to see that reptiles and mammals have something unique that not all tetrapods have, and that is a shelled egg. This shelled egg is really what lets reptiles and mammals break their link with water, where amphibians still are tied to that water for reproduction to occur. And I know we're getting into Thursday or Wednesday's lecture, but there are going to be some differences between mammals and reptiles. I'll list one of them here, which is the presence of hair. So mammals have hair, reptiles have scales. We'll list some other differences between mammals, but at least we've got a good roadmap. And like I said, by the end of today's lecture, we should be able to introduce amphibians. And if we can look inside this amphibian class, we're going to see examples of 3 groups inside amphibians. These groups are going to be called Amphibian Orders. Just to list them, there is Urodela. This is an order of amphibians that includes salamanders and newts. The second order of amphibians is called Anura. It includes the frogs and the toads. And then our last group of amphibians is called Apoda. Examples would include these amphibians called caecilians, and as their name suggests, they have lost their legs altogether. So with this roadmap, let's see if we can start at the top and look at examples of each of those organisms. So from our screen, we're going to start at the top of the chordate list, and we're going to see examples of Cephalochordata. Here's the Cephalochordata. Its common name is a lancelet. These things are about a foot long. They burrow themselves into kind of the sandy surf in a marine environment. And their mouth is kind of facing out of the sand, and any prey item in the water that happens to swim too close gets engulfed and trapped into the digestive system. The water gets pushed out through those pharyngeal gill slits, and then that prey item passes on through the digestive tract. This lancelet, you can see, is in its adult form, and even in its adult form, you can still see those 4 characteristics that all chordates have in common. The dorsal hollow nerve cord, supported by that notochord. There are the pharyngeal gill slits and that muscular postanal tail. There's even a little video that shows this thing wiggling around. I'll show that real quick. So there it is swimming right there. That's one of those lancelets. Here's another one that swims by right there. And you can kind of see that rippling of the body. It wiggles like a ribbon. It doesn't have a true vertebrae. So we'll jump back to the slides to look at the next example on our list, which is the Subphyla Urochordata. This Subphyla Urochordata is going to include things like Tunicates. This is also called a sea squirt because what it does is it filters water. You can see in the adult form, it's got this in siphon where water is pulled in. Any food items that are on the water are going to get trapped in this pharyngeal pouch. Clean water is going to get forced out, and again, food items move on to the digestive tract. In the adult stage, it's kind of highly modified to become this filter feeder. To see 4 characteristics that are present on all chordates, you have to go back to the larval stage of this tunicate. In their larval stage, you can see those 4 characteristics. Dorsal hollow nerve cord, notochord just underneath it, muscular postanal tail, and pharyngeal gill slits. So lancelets retain those 4 characteristics the entire part of their life cycle. These tunicates, they start to modify their adult form so that they don't have those 4 characteristics in their adult form. We have to find it in the larval form. And then as we zoom in even further, this third subphyla is of the Craniates. So that third branch there is going to include all of these chordates that have a skull. Our first example of a chordate that has a skull are the hagfishes. So the clade of Craniates is going to include hagfish as well as all of the vertebrates. If I can just go to this picture, here's a clade of the Craniates. We can see that, well, all of the vertebrates have a cranium except, let's try this again. So here we can see the clade of Craniates. If you have a skull, you're part of this clade of the Craniates. And nested inside the Craniates are the other clades. This vertebrate clade describes organisms that have a mineralized backbone. Notice that if you have a mineralized backbone, you already have a skull. So again, the subphyla Craniates includes all of the vertebrates as well as the hagfish. Hagfish are not vertebrates. They don't have a vertebrae, but they do have a cranium. Vertebrates have a true vertebral column. So when we compare these, let's look at our first example of the Craniates, this hagfish. Here's a hagfish. It might not be obvious what we're looking at, but here's the head region. It has a sucker-like mouth. It doesn't have any clasping jaws. This thing has coiled itself up because it doesn't have a true vertebrae. With just that delicate little notochord, it's still able to kind of tie itself up into these little loops. If you want to see how this thing moves, I've got a little video that shows it wiggling as well. I'll just show this without the sound. You can see those hagfish. They're tearing apart a whale carcass. If we go to this part, you can see how they feed. They're ripping out chunks of flesh with this sucker-like mouth. So they're kind of rasping at the flesh rather than chomping down on it. And the reason that they have to do that is because they don't yet have that clasping jaw. They just have that sucker-like mouth. They have a skull. They have no vertebrae. So that's hagfish. Let's look at the next organism on the list, which takes us into the vertebrate clade. Our first example of a true vertebrate is the lamprey, this class Petromyzontity. Here's a picture of a lamprey. You can see it looks a lot like that hagfish, but it's not able to kind of coil itself up into those loops. It's got a stiffened rod of bones. It's got a true vertebrae. You can see it also does not have a clasping mouth. It still has this sucker-like mouth with those pointy teeth that it uses to kind of rasp into its prey item and rip off chunks of flesh. If you want to see how that lamprey feeds, let's look at this short video. This is a lamprey feeding on the side of a salmon. You can see the lamprey's attached with that sucker-like mouth. The salmon doesn't like it. You can even see how it's kind of detached at least once and stuck back onto the side of this salmon. The good news in this video, the person kills the lamprey, detaches it from the fish, and throws the fish back so the fish makes it. But you can really see how that lamprey is stuck onto the side. Again, it's attached on there with that sucker-like mouth. Doesn't have any clasping jaws. And one thing that I want to point out, in these organisms that don't yet have a clasping jaw, so for hagfish and lamprey, if you look at those gill slits, in the case of this lamprey, we can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those little openings, 7 of those gill slits. What are in between those gill slits holding them open are these little cartilaginous support rods. Notice how what they really do is just open those gill slits so that water can pass through them and gas exchange can occur. Notice how when the first organisms that developed jaws, like where these jaw bones came from, is they came from what were previously these gill slit support rods. A few of these gill slit support rods became encased in more calcium phosphate. They were further calcified, and that's what led to this clasping jaw. Organisms that have a clasping jaw, the trade-off is that they have fewer gill slits. Again, they had to give up some of those gill slit support rods in order to form this jaw in the first place. So here's where, if we go back to the lamprey, it has no jaw, it has 7 of those gill slits. But if we go forward to this shark that does have a clasping jaw, it has only 5 gill slits. A few of those gill slits were traded off in order to develop this jaw. Okay, so here's a shark. It's an example of a cartilaginous fish. It's one of our first examples of organisms that has a clasping jaw. In addition to having the clasping jaw, we mentioned chondric. These have a skeleton made out of cartilage. The only bony parts are really the skull, the vertebrae, and the jaw. The rest of the skeleton, like the stuff in these pectoral fins and pelvic fins, is all cartilage. They, like I said, have jaws. The other notable thing is that we see paired appendages for the first time. So 2 pectoral fins, 2 pelvic fins. These allow this organism to cruise through the open water and be an efficient predator. Maybe another noteworthy thing is that sharks, if they stop moving, they sink to the bottom. They have to keep moving in order to stay floating in the water column. You might have seen this. There are some what are called nurse sharks. They're down in the aquarium in San Antonio. And if you've been into that room, you just see these nurse sharks on the bottom of the pool of the aquarium just kind of laying on top of one another. If sharks stop swimming, they sink to the bottom. That's because they lack any kind of internal tube that would allow them to float on their own. So what allows them to float is their motion. Kind of like an airplane. If an airplane slows down, there's nothing to keep it in the air. It's got to stay in motion. Okay, so chondric, these are our sharks. They have a jaw, and the clade that describes organisms that have a jaw is this clade called gnathostomes. So gnathostomes just mean that you have a jaw. Looking inside that clade of gnathostomes, the next clade that we're about to look at is a clade called Osteocthese. We know that ichthyes means fish, and Osteocthese just means bony fish. The osteo prefix there just means bony tissue. So Osteocthese describes fish that have a bony skeleton. So again, if we look past this group of chondrichthyes into the actual bony fish, there are 3 classes of bony fish. This Actinopterygii, which we're going to call the ray-finned fishes, it's the largest of those group of fishes. 90% of all fish belong to this Actinopterygii class. Smaller classes of fish that would include this Actinistia, the coelacanth, and then even Dipnoe, which are the lungfish. Let's look at pictures of that Actinopterygii. These are an example of the bony fish. We've got ray-finned fish and lobe-finned fish down here. They also, in addition to having a bony skeleton, they have the lung derivative, that structure that we listed called a swim bladder. Here is, again, more pictures of these ray-finned fishes. They're the largest of the fish group. But what's unique is this swim bladder. Here's a picture of that swim bladder. It's a long tube that's connected closely to some major blood vessels. And what these bony fish can do that have a swim bladder, they can extract gases from the bloodstream to fill up this tube like a balloon. And if this swim bladder isn't inflated with gases, it allows the fish to be more buoyant and floats closer to the surface of the water. And the opposite is true. The swim bladder can remove gases from the swim bladder and push those gases back into the bloodstream. That would be like deflating this balloon, and then the fish would sink further down into the water column. Bony fish that have the swim bladder can adjust to their buoyancy. So that means their fins don't have to constantly work to keep these animals floating in the water column. The swim bladder keeps them afloat, and that frees their pelvic fins to just do these minute little movements for adjustment. All right, so ray-finned fishes just have little rays of cartilage in their pectoral fins for support. We're going to see that lobe-finned fishes take it a step further and support their pectoral and pelvic fins with muscles and bones. So if you could give this thing a handshake, you'd feel bones and muscles in those pads. This coelacanth, even though it has lobed fins, it doesn't yet have a lung. So there is, in a video that we are going to see, examples of fish that also have these fleshy pads, the lobe fins, but they add to those fleshy pads a lung so they can breathe air. So that's the lungfish. If we go past the lungfish into the next clade of organisms, that is the clade of tetrapods. So all of these organisms have 4 limbs. We can see this is one of the first tetrapods. Those 4 limbs, you'll notice, are out to the sides of the body. This is an indication that those 4 limbs were not really adapted to support this organism out of the water. Instead, those forelimbs being out to the side are more likely to be used to push debris out of the way in shallow water, so it can get away from predators or chase down prey items. All tetrapods, like we said, have those four limbs, and if we look inside the tetrapod clade, we're going to see reptiles and mammals are also part of the tetrapod clade. They take it a step further and they add a shelled egg. So we're going to see next time shelled eggs in reptiles and mammals. Amphibians do not have that shelled egg, so they are still tied to water if they're going to complete their life cycle. If fertilization is going to occur, sperm is going to have to swim to the egg. So amphibians require water. Reptiles and mammals break that link with water and start to speciate in a wild variety of ways, which we'll see in our next class period. For the rest of the time, let's talk about these amphibians. If we could look at the class of amphibians, I've already written on the board there are three classes of amphibians to be aware of. Here are those three classes. The order Urodela, that includes the salamanders and the newts. That order Aneura, that includes the frogs and the toads. And then this order called Apoda, that includes an organism called the caecilians. These caecilians have lost their legs altogether, so they're legless amphibians, and they live in the rainforest. In the middle, we have our order Aneura, that includes the frogs and the toads. And what's unique about this order is that their adult forms have lost their tails. So unlike salamanders that retain their tail all the way through their adult stage, frogs and toads lose their tail. The other difference between this order Aneura and the salamanders, the order Urodela, we can see in frogs and toads, their hind limbs have become adapted for leaping. And you don't see that leaping adaptation in salamanders and newts. Their hind legs are just for walking around. So Urodela, salamanders and newts, retain their tail, and they have hind limbs that have not developed for leaping, which is what we see in this order Aneura. And then in the order Apoda, they've lost their legs altogether. They're burrowing under the ground. So they lost their legs, they've also lost their eyes. If we go back to the previous, this is the last slide, but if I go back to the previous slide, you can see characteristics that all amphibian groups have in common. So Apoda, Aneura, and Urodela, they all have moist skin. They all, being amphibians, have external fertilization, meaning that sperm and egg meet outside of the body, typically in a puddle of water, like you can see these two frogs. What's going on with these two frogs? One of the frogs is just dropping a bunch of eggs into this puddle of water, and then the second frog is dropping a bunch of sperm into that puddle of water, and sperm and egg have to meet externally. So again, shared characteristics of all amphibians. They have moist skin. They breathe through their skin, so it is necessary for it to stay moist in order for gas exchange to occur. I'm just going to reference the video link down here. I recommend that you click on it and watch it on your own time. This is something that I can't show a bootleg version of here in our recorded lecture. So I'll end it with this slide of the three different types of amphibians. We still have left on the chart the reptiles and mammals to mention next time. So hopefully this has been helpful. I'll close that off and we'll pick it up next time looking at our tetrapod clades and the differences between reptiles and mammals.